Hello everyone, today we talk about the 1187 Battle of Cresson during the Crusades era. This is a relatively minor clash compared to the one that followed in later in the same year at the Horns of Hattin. That saw the defeat of the Crusader army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem with against the Ayyubid forces of the Saladin. But nevertheless, it's very interesting. I'm passionate about tactics, and I kind of like minor clashes because sometimes they can provide interesting informations about that. This is not maybe really the case because we don't know much about how the battle was practically fought, tactically speaking. But nevertheless, the world development is kind of meaningful, relatively, especially to the to the nature of the Templar Knights as fighters, as an elite force, as we will be seeing now. So this battle followed into I'm gonna skip a little bit the broader strategical scenario, but it's still necessary. Basically, in a ride on a Muslim caravan during the period of truce between Jerusalem and Ayyubid Egypt was the cause of the outbreak of war once again. This caravan had been attacked by Reynald the Chatillon, Lord of Kerak, who is this kind of particular figure, in kind of unique in its own kind. Reynald is usually credited as being simply an unruly and passionate lord who basically made a mess because of his ambition in attacking Ayyubid Egypt. He was a vassal of the king of Jerusalem and placed into this let's say frontier area that had also it was close to the Red Sea. There are even certain actions that he performed, like amphibious operations, that are very interesting. Maybe one day we can look at that against the Egyptians, but he was kind of unruly. He wanted to carve basically a greater lordship on his own, and this was used sometimes even to as a pretext, as a casus belli, to eventually for the Ayyubids to launch war invasion once again on the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Really, the strategical situation is way more complicated than this because of, you can't think of the Kingdom of Jerusalem here and Egypt there, and as if the rest of the world did not exist. Anyone who has studied 12th century political and military relations in the Near East knows that it's practically a mess. Even what occurred into, I don't know, Italy had impacts on whatever was taking place there. So a very interconnected strategical situation that really played together with Europe and the Byzantine Empire and all. But the Battle of Cresson, in this sense, happened within a by chance, in the sense that 1187 was the scale invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem by Saladin, and eventually the same conquest of Jerusalem after the Battle of the Horns of Hattin. But there was a lot of diplomatical things going on, because basically the King of Jerusalem at this time, Guy of Lusignan, was practically struggling against Raymond III of Tripoli, who basically hadn't recognized his succession to the throne. It's a very complicated situation, but let's say that there was an embassy, we can say, that were sent from Jerusalem to negotiate with Raymond, basically. at Tiberias, and this delegation was made up of Gerard of Riedfort, who was master of Knights Templar, Roger de Moulins, a master of the Knights Hospitaliers, and Balian of Ibelin. Then also Joshua's Archbishop of Tyre, and Reginald Grenier, Lord of or Grenier, I don't know how you call them, Lord of Sidon. I mean, a major amount of nobles that didn't just went there with as diplomats, but also as with their own forces and all, because these were essentially kind of feudatories of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Here we have the Knights Templars and the Hospitaliers that are something relatively different, but essentially this was a try to set things between the two sides. And at this time, and this was complicated by the fact that Saladin was about to invade Jerusalem, so that had broader implications on the balance, the political military balance into the region. And Saladin had sent a small force towards Tiberias, led by Muzaffar ad-Din Gökberi, who was essentially the leading emir of the Sultan, and these were all of Turkmen descent in practice. They had broader relations, not just with with Egypt, but also with Syria. That is, at this time Saladin was influencing, exercising his influence over there. I mean, it was part of a broader Muslim kind of Turkish-influenced political and military system that was at that time fighting against the Crusader states, but sometimes also within each other. And so this punitive expedition was favorably looked upon by Raymond III of Tripoli, because he hoped that Saladin would defeat Gui of Lusignan, even if not annihilating, as we will be seeing after the battle of Cresson, because nobody wanted anyone to get excessive power. So this was kind of the ongoing playing of backing someone until he didn't become dangerous in turn against someone else. And how the whole thing basically first of all, on the force that was sent by Saladin, this wasn't really the main force. I mean, even Saladin was moving with his army, but this first detachment, we can call it, that went towards Tiberias was a minor force. Sometimes we, the real problem of the Battle of Cresson is that the sources are very kind of unprecise. There are both Christian and Muslim sources that are a bit unrelated. If I'm not wrong, the Muslim sources not even mention this clash, at least the contemporary ones. We have from the Christian side, the Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, which was actually written in the occasion of the Third Crusade for Richard Lionheart. But the whole events are kind of foggy, and we have even troubles in determining the actual numbers, especially of the Muslims. Even though also about the one of the Christians we're not extremely sure. The Muslim detachment force seemingly was, according to the sources, several thousands strong, like 6,000-7,000 strong, which is definitely a large number, because unless we don't see it as an army split in two, such numbers were kind of very much. Even for Egypt, that was definitely a substantial power. and could field such numbers. It also depends on the real quality of the troops involved in here, because one thing is just a guy with a shield and a spear, another thing is to have an heavily armored cavalryman. And my idea is that since we get these numbers from the Christian sources, at least, I don't know about the Muslim ones relatively to this, but seemingly this was kind of an exaggeration. Like for a detachment forces, these guys could have been even 1/10 of the actual total number. They might have numbered from 700 to 7,000, and we will not know. The reason is that this was a kind of a reconnaissance detachment. So a reconnaissance detachment is not 7,000 strong. Usually, at least it is something so big on its own that can work as a whole army in practice. Although, we can still believe it happened in some fashion. So it was advancing into Palestine towards Tiberias. By the way, at this time, it's seemingly Raymond, as you want to say it, the English or French way, was seemingly allowing this Muslim detachment to actually cross into these Galilean possessions of the same county of Tripoli, at the condition that they didn't do anything like pillaging, and that they would cross and return back in a single day. These are all kind of, we don't really know how things practically happened, but seemingly there was this kind of double playing, within considering the balancements that we were talking about before. So Gökberi or Kukburi, this Ayyubid Emir, as you want to call him, reconnaissance would have passed seemingly without incident into these lands, but the masters of the hospital and the temple, so basically Gérard of Riedfort and Roger de Moulin, decided to basically engage the enemy. They had been sent there exactly to, as we were saying, to Parliament with Raymond of Tripoli, but they decided immediately to summon their own forces and to go against the enemy. So, relatively to the forces of the Christians, what we know is that there were a very few, like 130, 140 knights, 80 of which were veteran of the Templar garrisons of Khartoum and Faba, or also other places, and other, let's say, 50 or 60 secular, we can say, knights that went with them. And really, as far as I know from the sources, I admit I haven't read the sources, also because partly they are kind of as many medieval sources, they don't really give an overall comprehensive understanding of how things really went. I can perfectly sympathize with this because I remember having written a master thesis about a battle into which, and it was also fairly well documented compared to this one, and later in time, at the end of the 13th century, about which basically we don't really know how things really went. I wrote like 260 pages for reconstructing a battle about which ultimately we cannot tell how it really went. So this is normal. ordinary administration when talking especially about medieval sources, especially if they if they're combined in a certain measure. And at least in that battle that I studied, there could be there was enough data to kind of make an hypothesis about a rational, a military logic development of that battle. Here, we don't really know, but a few things that I managed here to recollect is that basically the various troops that were put together weren't actually all the crusading force that existed there. Practically Gerard had assembled this first corps of Templar Knights of 130, 140 in total. But relatively, for instance, to Balin of Ibelin, we don't really know. We know that he had stopped along the way. He was at Nablus, there was a fifth of his. Reginald was also elsewhere. So this wasn't really the overall Christian force. There are, if I'm not wrong, there is even the mentioning of infantry involved, because at this time, at the end of the 12th century, infantry was already kind of rising, especially in crusading warfare. In coordination and in support with knights, also in important battles, and there was something like 300 or 400 infantry around that could help. But seemingly the Templars didn't even the Templars didn't even wait. Gerard the Red Fort didn't even wait for these troops to recollect. And he set out to intercept the Muslim army. More of this later, because I think it's interesting, it's in its own kind. But relatively to numbers, what I mean is that this battle eventually took place without all the Christian forces being assembled, and therefore we don't know how many Christian forces were actually out there. And since we don't really know how many the Ayyubids really were, depending on whether you can talk about 700 or 7,000, it really makes a big difference, because one thing is meeting an army of, I don't know, 700, even relatively light troops with 140 elite knights, like the Templars one, or just like the knights were in Western forces at the time, is one thing. Meeting 7,000 is different. But on the other hand, even if the Ayyubids had been 700 and well armored, well, I don't know, if all forces assembled, Christian forces assembled had been, I don't know, say 600, well, that's almost 700. So you understand how really speculative and this whole thing is. And I'm saying this because usually this battle, I found it pictured on many books, especially talking about the Templars, and therefore kind of winking at them like, oh yeah, these were cool guys. Remember the Battle of Cresson, like this hopeless attack of like 140 knights against 7,000 Turks, and it sounds, pretty heroic, doesn't it? And I will comment that later, in the sense that it's still plausible, even that this thing happened under a certain light, but in military affairs, and generally speaking, looking at military history, aside even from historiographical exaggerations, it's a bit difficult that you're gonna throw 140 elite knights away just to be annihilated by such superior numbers, just for the sake of, I don't know, killing the heathens. And there is still some rationality, some logics, some concrete military logics in these decisions that can maybe emerge from even from a messy ensemble of sources like the one we have for this so poorly described and known battle. And this is interesting because what basically the Templars did, and we don't know how, they actually attacked the Muslims while they were at the springs of Cresson. It was the Christian French name for the springs that sometimes you find named as Safuria, or I don't know, other Arab terms that, however, they are all transliterations, so I don't really know what it practically means. But this is an interesting point, because even if you look at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, that was essentially it. I mean, this desertic or semi-desertic area of the Near East, strategically speaking, marches had to go on basically stopping at these springs. People, it's never too much to, it's never enough to stress how important water reserves are into these contexts. Like big armies, even if they are in Northern Europe with rivers or lakes everywhere, if they are not practically close to one of those water sources, they're gonna die of thirst in practice, and epidemics spreading and all this mess. You can imagine in a place like Palestine in the 12th century, in late spring, by the way. The Battle of Cresson took place on May the 1st, 1187. These were very important points that even helped strategically in knowing where the enemies would have hit, in the sense that there were certain obligated passage points that were dotted. There were exactly these springs, because you don't just need water, you need drinkable water, you need enough of it for a prolonged time. Excuse me. So you have, it's as if on the map you had all these dots where basically the enemy army is moving, even if you don't know what their plans really are, if they're crossing here. So the plan was seemingly for these Templars to attack, at least I can say, the Muslims where they were simply drinking, but this could really be suggested in a sense that it's not that the Ayyubids were stupid, that were in enemy territory, and they, even if they had gotten a free passage from the Christians, that they were so stupid not to guard while they were hydrating at the springs. But it's still true that probably this drinking phase, even for the horses and all, implied that basically the Muslim army had to stop in a fashion that wasn't fully ready for battle in some ways. So some guys would guard all around, but with 140 knights you could really mount up a decent charge to hope to break whatever resistance there was and to attack these guys. Especially if they were so few, like the minimal numbers suggest. And the would suggest. There is also, as far as we know, there was also pretty some sort of tactical development of this battle that was probably more complex than it seems. So this means that the Muslims were able to were ready to meet the Crusaders. They were seemingly feigning a retreat, which was kind of a very typical tactics of the Eastern armies. And surely a man like Gerard de Riedfort as the Templar master who had been, fighting against these populations, and I mean there was a broader understanding of the tactics of these Eastern enemies since practically one century since the Crusades has started, and the Templars had been there all the time. So the I mean, at least long enough to obviously know what kind of tactics the enemies did. And feigned retreat is obviously something that you do in order to attract the enemy somewhere. And this was pretty cleverly done by the Eastern armies that on average they were lighter, or at least they had much larger lighter contingents than the normal Cresson armies. At this time that kind of tried to compensate by using intern local troops like the Turcopoles, that were essentially the same troops that the Ayyubids used for doing this. But here we don't have mention of further lighter troops used in here. So the Gerard, however, seemingly ordered a charge against these enemies, by the way, against Roger's advice. So there is this kind of I can't say rivalry because it's excessive, but in practice the Templars and the Hospitallers were a bit different from each other. The Templars were really the guys who were conceived like this fanatic, incredibly strong and aggressive elite unit of fighters that even protected the Hospitallers at some point. And the Hospitallers had also their own armed retinues, but they were more about, in fact, hospitalization, we can say. But they weren't such a strong, at least by tradition, elite force. I can't say elite because they were also elite, but let's say that the Templars were more skilled were stronger, militarily speaking, and here it's meaningful that from the sources we say that Roger de Moulin basically told the master Hospitaller order told Gerard of Riedfort, the master of the Knights Templar, not to attack, not to charge. So seemingly there is the hint that there was something kind of sneaky being done by the Ayyubid army, that someone in the Crusader contingent recognized as dangerous and as something bold and not to respond to, even though we must say that tactically speaking it's not that sometimes you have too much choice. Like, considering the Western warfare this time, really the heavy charges of cavalry again usually were successful against the lighter Muslim troops, although they had to be done at the very right moment. So there was a lot of first of all, competition among the same Westerners that had this kind of cocky, arrogant attitude for which they wanted always to be the first at charging, not to look at cowards, and to be the first over the others, and this caused problems. But there is also the problem that you don't have many chances actually once that the opportunity is passed to maybe attack at the right moment at a point. So I'd say that discussions like this, like let's attack now, no, let's wait, were out there all the time in warfare all the time. Also from the Muslims. I mean, the Muslims had a greater a difficulty in this sense, because they probably didn't wait very much for harassing the enemy. But the real problem is that what they could really do in terms of reserves to meet up the eventual charge of the heavy Christian knights. Also, the Muslims had heavily armored cavalry, but seemingly in lesser numbers, also because they weren't really feudal societies like the Western ones, who were largely at this time. But the real problem here is that we have a few we have an elite of Christian knights that are elite because they cost a freaking lot, but they're elite also numerically speaking. Like the Templar Knights this time were probably deploying greater part of their troops into this battle, in the sense that I think by the some year before, the overall number of Templar Knights was like 120. At the beginning of the 13th century, there were like 300. So if at the Battle of Cresson there were 80, well, that's a pretty big force, and also made up of veterans, of people of human resources that you can not really replace from a day to another, and they all ended to be slaughtered. And we know that this is what happened because the knights attacked seemingly without waiting for the infantry, because this was really Roger's advice. Let's wait for the infantry, those 300-400 infantry that we were waiting for. And the idea is very clever in the sense that infantry could give a defense. You know that cavalry as an arm cannot defend unless you not dismount. So once that your own charge is halted, the momentum is lost, you're basically exposed to the attack of someone else. These elite knights were very heavy, also the horses were easily, they were they didn't have such a huge resistance. They all concentrated their forces for a charge, maybe 2, maximum 3. But think even about the environmental situation here. We are in the desert. The Muslims had much more, running lighter cavalry that could attack and move quite quickly, so they could easily surround it and slaughtering them. And this is how it basically happened. Without having the chance of retreating amongst a mass of infantrymen, of spearmen that can fence off the Muslim cavalry attacks, these guys, these Templar Knights and the other knights that were with them, were easily, first of all, repulsed, seemingly, in their own charge. So they basically failed even their own charge, and eventually they were killed as they were exhausted. And seemingly even the infantry forces that came later were also slaughtered. So the only surviving here seemingly was Gerard. So this is kind of sad also, because he basically, if he had made the wrong choice, he didn't pay for it, as Roger de Moulin died, and he had instead given, probably, at least according to this narrative, the right advice. And he kind of survived like with just like 3 knights of the total, and while seemingly the 40 other knights were at least captured, and all the others, Templars and Hospitallers, killed. I don't think that this has to do anything in terms of, that the Muslims killed the Hospitallers or Templars and they captured instead, they took alive the other secular knights. I don't think any source suggests this, but the important is that basically this elite force was annihilated, and this reversed really the strategic balance of even of the situation, because at this point Saladin advanced with the rest of his army to Palestine, going towards Jerusalem, and Raymond the Third of Tripoli at that point basically was surprised of this seemingly strange or at least disastrous annihilation of the Templars and Hospitallers that he probably didn't expect even himself. And he allied strongly with Guy of Lusignan, that he immediately recognized as a king of Jerusalem, like saying, okay, now we made it big. we kind of let the forces of Jerusalem to be partially, at least some of their elite forces, to be annihilated by the Muslims. Now let's help definitely Jerusalem, because it's growing too weak and the Muslims can't take it. And eventually the Christians were defeated at battles of the Horns of Hattin, that instead was practically the loss of the kingdom of Jerusalem and eventually of all the Christian states of Outremer in practice, because even if Acre fell in 1291, basically by taking Jerusalem it was just a matter of time before the Muslims captured all the rest of the conquest of Jerusalem, really strategically speaking, opened, paved the path of the Muslim advance at that point. For many reasons, they didn't need to attack them from the sea anymore. They kind of retook the Holy City. They had major connection with Syria, so it was done. So that's really the turning point of the Crusader era, we can say, probably. And definitely the Battle of Cresson was, in this sense, a something that favored the outcome eventually of the same battle Hattin. If the Christians had won, they might have achieved something in terms of, I don't know, maybe Saladin would have had such an easy way to eventually advance and to defeat the Christians, the whole Christian army of Jerusalem. Maybe he would have aborted the invasion. We do not know. But history might have taken another path. So instead, by this 140 elite troops that were slaughtered at Cresson, at the Cresson Springs, seemingly it really made the difference in the bigger picture. The question is, how could really the Christians win this battle? And this is, I believe, the most interesting part of the whole thing, because strategically speaking, it's pretty. It's all pretty simple, and we know what it happened, strategically speaking, quite clearly. What we do not know is how this situation was produced on the battlefield, how, tactically speaking, the Christians were defeated. And as I was saying before, the usual narrative that I at least advise you not to believe in, if you ever find it written, is that this 130 knights attacked an army of 7,000 Muslims. This isn't really how it happened, in my opinion. This is not how historically we can objectify, in the sense that if you find a number written into a source, it doesn't mean that it is true. It doesn't mean automatically that it's false either, but giving the overall numbers, strategical resources, and if you know the military history of the time, you know that these numbers are normally inflated at, with these ciphers. What I find instead more interesting is trying to rationalize this battle and try to understand how the whole thing happened, because I believe we kind of talked about this now during the description of the events for how we know them, but there are there are certain extremes that you can draw You can draw the extreme, in fact, of the elite, a few knights that launch against an assault against the major Islamic army and they got slaughtered heroically. There is another more rational and kind of more logical reconstruction that you can do, always by speculating, by simply recognizing that from certain hints that we have. First of all, we know that the forces didn't practically the Cresson forces weren't united at this point. Balin of Abilene kind of acknowledged this later. He sent like an esquire to see what the thing had happened, and he knew that this terrible battle had taken place. Why the Cresson forces didn't recollect and moved as one against the enemy is, according to me, probably I don't know, it's a mystery, but it can be explained in the sense that, first of all, the sources stress that the Templar master kind of wanted to attack. There was an hasty decision to attack the enemy. We don't know for which reason. Maybe he had spotted this kind of an advantageous situation in which the Muslims were stopping at the springs and by making their horses drink, or they were maybe on the distance they kind of looked disordered or not ready to battle. But on the other hand, we know that we know of this feigned retreat, so there were surely Muslim troops around that guarded the situation. So we don't really know why they attacked. But it's really the strategical situation that probably made it something sudden, because these Christian guys were sent there just for an embassy in practice, and they weren't probably even expecting the Muslims to cross. I mean, they knew they were there, but they didn't know that Raymond of Tripoli had let them cross into that land. So probably there was some animosity even between the Jerusalemans and the one against the Tripolitanians. We can say the Tripolians. I don't know how to say that. So that maybe when the Christian forces saw these Muslim crossings, they understood that maybe the Count of Tripoli had betrayed them, and therefore they thought that there was something going on, and the best thing would have been to attack these guys. That maybe seemed less frightening than definitely a 7,000 strong army. It's still interesting that there is this debate between the Templar and Hospitaller masters, like saying let's attack, let's not attack. Which really, as I was saying before, is something normal in the tactical practice of into the military traditions of those places and times, from both sides, both for the knights to wait for the right moment for the charge, and for the Turks to instead just harassing them and making feigned retreats and all. In this sense, we know that the battle seemingly was lost because of the charge wanted by Gerard. But who are we to really say that that's the cause? I mean, given that we know so few about the battle. Maybe it was really the best moment to attack, apparently, or maybe. And there is, by the way, also another account, I don't remember which is that actually pretty much states that Gerard had not attacked hastily, and that he eventually was caught by an assault from the flank, if I'm not wrong, or something like that. So there is not even this caricaturization of Gerard as the guy who wanted to attack point, made the stupid mistake and all. This was um, the Templar's master, so he knew his job, I believe. And it might be that the Muslims, maybe, I don't know, made them to successfully make them fall into an ambush. It's possible. As it's simply possible that it was a Cresson mistake just to advance at the same time. For the rest, the fact that eventually the knights were surrounded and slaughtered, it's kind of meaningful, because this surely says that this is probably the only sure thing, that these knights were much less than the Muslims in numerical terms. Probably even if the Muslims had been a minimum of 700, even 130 knights can be theoretically attracted with a feigned retreat or ambush in some way, given the mobility of the Muslim army, the usual mobility of the Muslim cavalry compared to the one of the heavy Western one, and to surround them with the sheer numbers and to destroy them and to annihilate them. In this sense, it's also very interesting that infantry seemingly the lack of infantry from the western side eventually caused the defeat, that the knights might have launched other charges if they had cover behind the spearmen. It's also interesting that there was such a high mortality. And relatively to this point, I wanted to say that indeed the Templars could have been the guys who really threw themselves into the midst without even counting how the enemies were. Because really the Templars, from a psychological point of view, in terms of training, of ideological mindset and all, were really the guys who were actually projected for that. The Templar Knight had to do physically that. It had even to die into the midst of battle after having taken out tens of enemies, which was something feasible in the sense that individually speaking, these were true professionals, but warfare was done in formation, and all the cohesion of these knights actually stood in the moment of the charge. And then if they were exposed to any other enemy, that they could grow vulnerable to the arrows. Think about the horses. The horses normally at this time weren't armored. So sometimes even the only way to not to create too much disorder and confusion within the cavalry was just to launch against the enemy. And that was probably the main concern of why there was such a great importance for the timing of the charge. That was definitely present also in Western battlefields, I can assure you, but that probably in this it was a bit worse, because being showered by these arrow fire continuously could really create many problems, especially for the cohesion of a cavalry formation. Because one that you are an infantryman, you can place yourself kneeling. We know this happened like at the Crusade of Louis IX in Egypt, and in front of the shield, placing the lances outwards and really waiting for the attack to run out of steam. But if you are on horseback and you don't have an armored horse, if you have, and you are already deployed in formation, if you stay under the fire for a long time, that's gonna simply disrupt the formation. The horses are gonna get nervous, wounded, and there is all an internal disposition of the troops in order to make it an effective combat formation, and to perform a charge well. That it's all basically the key to success. So there are many reasons for which this battle can have turned wrong for the Christians, and there could have been an equal amount of factors that could have made it turn bad for the Muslims as well. So we don't really know. And all we know that is that these guys got eventually exterminated, and that's practically what what happens in situations that, however, are a bit hopeless, because once there is a non-coming back, a point of non-return in certain military operations, especially if you are a heavy guy that gets into a midst of enemies and these are lighter, can even run after you. I mean, either you defeat them into melee, either you're done practically, because even if you want to flee, you are slower, you get bogged down and cut down in practice. So I really think that this is how it happened, and probably there was also a very violent clash at some point, also in melee combat in some sort, also because from the Muslim side it's not that you take down the Crusader knights just by throwing arrows at them. You can bog down their charge, you can halt them a little bit in that way, but then you have to intervene with some shock force, because arrows really are not enough. Even with composite bows and all, these guys were still decently armored and even trained to fight until death, even when bleeding and shocked and all. And these were elites. So they were really trained to do something like that. So in my opinion, in the end, this battle could be interpreted a little bit like the classical Christian defeat into this hostile environment, for bad timing, for bad organization, for even some certain tactical disadvantages that we can see. Even the attack in general is something dangerous inherently. As long as you are in defense, you can achieve more. The problem is that why do you decide to attack? And this might be the key even to the battle, that the sources identifying this wrong decision to attack without support of the infantry, which is kind of logical, but cannot solve the problem in practice, in strictly historical terms. So I hope that you liked this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel for receiving further news about my contents. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!